Have you ever attempted to solve a problem and then discovered that your solution to your problem actually made your problem exponentially worse? For example, sometimes I'm amazed at how the government does this. They, in good faith, see a problem and think, let's introduce this piece of legislation, which for sure will solve our problem. And after the legislation is passed and has had a chance to run its course, they discover their solution hasn't solved anything. In fact, it made the problem way more complicated and far worse. This was the case in the Catholic Church in the early 15th century. You see, the church had a problem. Instead of one pope, it had two. Now, sometimes we think more is better, but the Catholic Church is a monarchical government, and if there's one thing you don't want in a monarchical government, it's more than one monarch. Chaos ensued. Not only was there the Pope in Rome, there was the Pope who thought that having the papal seat in Avignon, in what is now southern France, was far better. And so he established, or better said, re-established the Avignon papacy. Countries were immediately divided on who to support, with Spain and France supporting the Avignon anti-pope, and rival countries like England, Germany, and Italy supporting the Roman pontiff. And each pope had its own college of cardinals that supported its respective papacy. So when either the Roman pope or the Avignon anti-pope died, the cardinals in that particular faction would elect a new pope to replace him. There were attempts to solve the problem. In 1304, after the death of the Roman pontiff, the cardinals in Rome told the Avignon cardinals, "We'll hold off on electing a new pope so that you can join us if you can convince your anti-pope in Avignon to resign." You know who thought that was a terrible idea? The Avignon pope. As far as he was concerned, he was the legitimate pope, and so there was no way he was going to abdicate his throne. There was a time when both popes, realizing that they were at an impasse and recognizing that this dualistic monarchy was severely hurting both the Catholic Church and the Western world, decided that they would resign and let their respective cardinals either choose one of them or select a whole new pope. Then at the last minute they said, "Nah, just kidding, I changed my mind," and they both refused to resign. In 1409, the cardinals took measures into their own hands and convened the Council of Pisa in order to solve the problem of having two popes. While this council was well attended, it isn't considered an ecumenical or a general council because it did not have the support of the pope. In fact, the whole aim of the council was to depose the two popes, and that's what they did. Only this did not solve the problem because the other two popes refused to resign. And so what was meant to be a solution to a problem ended up amplifying the problem and making it worse, because after the Council of Pisa, the Catholic Church had three men claiming to be the rightful successor of St. Peter: the Pope in Rome, the Pope in Avignon, and now the Pope elected in Pisa. This problem went on for a number of years until finally it was solved at the Church's 16th Ecumenical Council, the Council of Constance. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. A heartfelt thank you to any returning listeners, and a very warm welcome if you are new to this podcast. Just as a brief introduction, I was a Protestant for 39 years, including a Baptist pastor for 11 of those years, and at the age of 41, I came home to the Catholic Church. This podcast is my mission and labor of love, where I try to take complex Catholic topics and break them down into bite-sized pieces that you can digest in about 17 minutes, more or less. Now, before I move on, I would be remiss not to ask for your help. Writing and producing these episodes on the 21 ecumenical councils takes somewhere between 10 to 20 hours for each episode. That means that for every minute of this episode, it has taken about an hour of work, research, writing, recording, and editing. And so if you find this podcast to be helpful, I would love for you to buy me a cup of coffee. I don't really mean buy me a cup of coffee unless you run into me in a coffee shop. I mean, become a supporter of this podcast, which is only $5 a month. Think of it like buying me a cup of coffee. Thank you for your generosity. Now, before we talk about the Council of Constance, let's do a brief recap. And if you haven't listened to the previous episode, and maybe even the previous two episodes, you may want to do that before listening to this one, because that will explain all the events which led to the Council of Constance. Let's start our recap with January 17, 1377, a remarkable and revolutionary day. Pope Gregory XI brought the papacy to Rome. Now, that may sound odd to you. Hasn't the papacy always been in Rome? Well, not exactly. From 1305 to 1376, there were 7 successive French popes that didn't live in Rome. They lived in Avignon, a city on the Rhone River in what is now France. And this is known as the Avignon papacy, which was the focus of episode 167. The 7th of the Avignon popes, Pope Gregory XI, finally brought the chair of St. Peter to the church established by St. Peter, the Church in Rome. Pope Gregory XI only lived for about a year in Rome, and after his death, chaos ensued. While the College of Cardinals were meeting to elect a new pope, an angry mob formed in Rome demanding that they elect an Italian. The last thing they wanted was another French pope who would move the papacy back to Avignon, and so the cardinals acquiesced and elected an Italian who became Pope Urban VI. However, a few months into Pope Urban VI's reign, some French cardinals got together and said that because they felt pressured into electing him, his pontificate was no longer valid. They instead elected a Frenchman who took on the name of Clement VII and moved his anti-papacy to Avignon. This wasn't the first time there was a pope and an anti-pope, but it might have been the most prominent time thus far in history. It was tearing the world into factions, some countries supporting the Roman pontiff, others supporting the Avignon papacy. This multi-papal dilemma is referred to as the Great Western Schism, or sometimes called the Great Papal Schism. While the world was divided on who the legitimate pope was, I think it's fair to say there was a strong consensus that having two popes was not good for the world. A solution had been proposed and grew in popularity that both popes should resign. Let both popes resign and let the College of Cardinals come together as one group and elect a new pope. Let's hit the reset button. At first, it seemed as though Gregory, the Pope in Rome, and Benedict, the Pope in Avignon, were on board with this idea. They had both signaled that they would agree to resign. However, there was a lot of political pressure. Think about it. France was in the middle of a major war with England, and having a French Pope surrounded by French cardinals in close proximity to France, keep in mind that Avignon at the time was not technically in France, that was a major boost for them. They had a lot to lose by sending the papacy back to Rome and further away from French influence. This political pressure, along with their own egos, eventually led the two rival popes to change their minds and decide not to resign after all. Seeing that these popes were at an impasse, the College of Cardinals chose to take matters into their own hands. A majority of them agreed to meet in the city of Pisa in 1409. If the rival popes were not going to cooperate and help them solve this problem, they were going to do it on their own, depose the two popes, and select a new one. Perhaps these cardinals thought that both popes would see the writing on the wall and willingly abdicate their positions and give their blessing on the council, thus making it an ecumenical council. However, that did not happen. The cardinals deposed the two popes, and then they elected a new pope. But because the Roman pontiff and the Avignon antipope refused to resign, now the world had three popes. You may be wondering how the Catholic Church traces its apostolic succession in a time of chaos like this. Who do we consider to be the rightful pope when you have three different papal lines? I like to say that the Catholic Church is always evaluating and interpreting history with the advantage of hindsight. For example, consider these ecumenical councils. We say that the first one was the Council of Nicaea in 325, and then the second one was the First Council of Constantinople in 381, and so forth. However, the Church had lots of various councils throughout the years, and when the first few happened, it's not like the Church got together and declared, we're going to make an ecumenical council, and this is how we're going to define an ecumenical council, and these will be the effects of the council, and so forth. Rather, as more councils met over the years, it began to look back in history and to distinguish between an ecumenical council and other types of councils. The same is true with periods of time where you have rival popes or anti-popes. At the time this was going on, you could be forgiven for not knowing which pope was the legitimate pope. The Catholic Church, with the advantage of hindsight and being removed from the emotion and the pressing politics, has looked at history and said the legitimate pope was the Roman pontiff. He was elected by the College of Cardinals in Rome, and while there may have been some outside pressures, it does not invalidate his election as the Vicar of Christ. Therefore, it is he and his successors who are the legitimate successors of St. Peter, and therefore the Avignon papacy, as well as the Pisan popes, are illegitimate. Well, that's helpful for us half a millennium later, but the Catholic Church, in the heat of the moment, did not have the advantage of hindsight. They were really wrestling with who the legitimate pope was, and at the same time struggling to figure out what to do with the fact that they had three rival popes dividing the Church and the world. Right around this time, Emperor Sigismund had been gaining authority over various regions as he defeated the Ottoman Turks. Like previous emperors, he saw that in order to have a more unified empire, he needed to mend the fractured Western Catholic Church. He proposed the idea of a 16th Ecumenical Council to solve this dilemma of three popes. He brought the idea to the Pisan Pope, John the 23rd, and suggested that it be held in the city of Constance in Germany. So in 1413, Emperor Sigismund announced to the world that there would be an ecumenical council in the city of Constance, and it would convene on All Saints' Day in 1414. I think it would be safe to say that each of these three papal claimants knew there was a strong possibility that they would need to resign, but at the same time, each were hoping that they would win out at the end of the day and be selected as the legitimate pope at the Council of Constance. Or perhaps at the very least, they could negotiate some sort of consolation prize and walk away with some level of dignity, even if it meant having to leave the papal throne. And keep in mind that the Pope has the power to elect cardinals, and popes generally elect cardinals that share their vision. And so each of these popes probably thought that they had a strong case for remaining in office, considering that the council would be made up of their supporters, cardinals and bishops that were loyal to their particular papacy. And while ego certainly had influence on this whole situation, it's important to remember that these were the leaders of Christendom. And I imagine that ultimately they really did want what was best for the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Three popes causing major divisions ecclesiastically and politically was not a sustainable long-term or even short-term solution. I think they recognized that for the good of the church, they needed to be willing to resign, though I think each of them had hoped to prevail in the end. This was particularly the case with John the 23rd, who felt that he had a strong case of being selected as the legitimate pope by the Council of Constance. After all, he was instrumental in working with the emperor to convene the council in the first place. The Roman pontiff, Pope Gregory XII, who in hindsight was the legitimate pope, was 87 years old at the time. His primary concern seems to be his legacy of legitimacy. He wanted to be recognized as the legitimate pope, and he was willing to resign provided that the council did not select John the 23rd. Meanwhile, Benedict XIII, the Avignon pope, wasn't even in Avignon anymore. He had retired down in Spain. The Council of Constance began in November of 1414 as planned. What makes this council so different from previous ones is that this didn't last for a few weeks or even a few months. There were 45 sessions over the course of 4 years. By December, Emperor Sigismund had arrived along with lots of cardinals, bishops, theologians, and canon lawyers, and by the spring of 1415, it was clear that the only path forward was the resignation of all three popes. There was just not enough support for one of them to remain on the throne. And so each of them agreed to resign provided that the others resign as well. And as part of the resignation, they wanted to work out some sort of agreement. I'll resign, but this is what I want. I want to be a cardinal bishop, or I want some land, or I want to be remembered as the legitimate pope, or I just don't want to be murdered by the next pope because I'm seen as a threat to his papacy. Stuff like that. They were each, in a sense, negotiating the terms of their surrender. Meanwhile, Emperor Sigismund demanded that everyone stay in the city of Constance until the council had concluded. I'm not sure that he, or anyone else for that matter, realized just how long this council would last. However, the Pisan Pope, John the 23rd, fled the Council of Constance by disguising himself as a stable worker, and that threw a wrench in things. I want to talk about 4 decisions that were made at this council. As always, I've provided links in the show notes that provide more details if you want to dive deeper, but we just don't have the time to talk about all 45 sessions. The 4 major issues I want to discuss are conciliarism, the condemnation of a couple of heretics who were forerunners to the Protestant Reformation, the schedule for future councils, and the election of a new pope. Let's start with conciliarism. This was the belief that a council had more authority than the pope. This was a popular viewpoint during the time because the cardinals and bishops felt that the only way forward was to depose the popes who refused to abdicate their positions. Furthermore, this was aided along by the fact that the Pisan Pope, and perhaps the more popular of the rival popes, had vanished from the council. Can there be an ecumenical council without the pope? What if the Pope vetoes the council's decision and declares it an invalid council like the Robber Synod of Ephesus in 449, something we talked about way back in episode 152? And so during the 5th session on April 6, 1415, the council issued a famous decree known as Hic Sancta Synodos that declared that the councils have greater authority than the Pope. Later, the Church declared this document to be invalid and heretical. In fact, the First Vatican Council said the opposite of what was declared at the Council of Constance. The authority of the Church is the bishops in conjunction with the Pope. A necessary ingredient, if you will, in an ecumenical council is the consensus of the Pope. So what do we do with this? Do we just say that an ecumenical council got something wrong? Well, one of the ways around this issue has to do with Pope Gregory XII and the timing of his representation at the council. You see, he wasn't at Constance when the council started, but in July of 1415, 3 months after the council issued their controversial decree, his representatives arrived in Constance with 2 bulls. The first was convoking the council as a general council, and the second was issuing his resignation. So one of the ways scholars deal with this dilemma is by saying that the council was an invalid council until July 4th, 1415, when Gregory, the rightful pope, officially convoked the council. Anything that happened before that, including the issuing of a conciliar decree of Haec Sancta Synodos, was not binding since the council was convened without the blessing of the pope. Thus, the Ecumenical or General Council of Constance didn't technically begin in November of 1414, but rather on July 4th, 1415, when it was officially convoked by Pope Gregory XII, the rightful pope, and then he promptly resigned. Let's talk about another major issue of the council, and that is dealing with an English preacher named John Wycliffe. Now, if you know me, you know that I was a Protestant for most of my life, and John Wycliffe is considered a hero in the Protestant world. There's even an organization known as Wycliffe Bible Translators that works to translate the Bible in every language. Now, as a Catholic, I have to come face to face with the reality that someone I thought was a hero was very much considered a heretic in Catholic circles. John Wycliffe denied the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, preaching that it was merely a figurative presence. He took aim against the clergy of the church. He said, quote, "The Pope is the Antichrist made manifest," end quote. He also claimed, quote, "There are 12 procurators and disciples of Antichrist, the Pope, cardinals, patriarchs, archbishops, bishops, archdeacons, officials, deans, monks, canons, and their 2 peaked hats, the recently introduced pseudo-friars and pardoners," end quote. He denied the validity of holy orders and called them unbiblical. And when I read some of his claims, I'm like, this guy was insane. And I think even many Protestants, if they knew what he actually said, might be taken aback by some of his assertions. I can't help but see the anti-Catholicism in all of this, where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think Protestants make heroes out of these people simply because they railed against the Catholics, while ignoring all the claims they actually said. By the time of the Council of Constance, John Wycliffe, the forerunner of Protestantism, was already dead. He had suffered from a stroke in 1384 while saying Mass at a parish and died a few days later. One of the other proponents of similar ideas was John Huss, who was alive and present at the Council of Constance. He was asked to recant his views, and when he didn't, he was submitted to the secular authorities and then burned at the stake. The council ordered the burning of his and Wycliffe's works. The third aspect I want to talk about is how the council decided to hold future councils. In Session 39 in October 1417, it declared that the Church should adhere to a regular schedule of ecumenical councils to proactively deal with potential future schisms. It decreed the next council start 5 years after the Council of Constance, the next one 7 years after the previous one ended, and then there should be a council every 10 years. Now, that might not seem like a very big deal to us in our day and age when bishops can just hop on a plane and be in Vatican City within a matter of hours. But we're talking about the 15th century where travel was treacherous. A journey to Rome could take months and cost a fortune. Keep in mind that this council lasted for 4 years. What if future councils were similar? What would happen if a bishop was gone from his post for a few years every decade? This could be problematic. This brings me to the fourth aspect of this council, the election of a new pope, Odon Colonna, who became Pope Martin V. He would reign as pope from 1417 until his death in 1431. He was a deacon at the time of his election, so he had to first be ordained as a priest, then a bishop, then the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope. To his credit, Martin V tried to follow the schedule of councils prescribed by the Council of Constance. In 1423, he summoned the Council of Siena, but it was so poorly attended that Pope Martin V dissolved it and scheduled the next council for 7 years later, as was prescribed at the Council of Constance. This would become the Council of Basel, and actually we know it by another name, the Council of Florence, the Catholic Church's 17th Ecumenical Council, and the topic of our next episode on Why Catholic. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox.
As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.